Political analyst Tom Gross is joining us now from Tel Aviv to discuss the latest developments. Good to see you, Tom.
Hello, good afternoon.
Now, how might the expected Israeli invasion in the Gaza Strip impact regional stability, and what are the geopolitical implications of this conflict?
Okay, well, they are potentially enormous. We have President Biden traveling tomorrow to Israel to visit. He doesn't travel as much as other presidents in the past because of his age. It's very significant that he should come. Chancellor Scholz of Germany is in Israel today, and President Macron of France has announced he will come sometime in the coming days. So this is really a pivotal moment. I think we should look at it on two levels. One is the level involving the Israelis and Palestinians. The other is a much wider geopolitical structure, mainly involving Iran, but also Lebanon and Syria. In a way, it's Biden or the United States saying, we're back. You think we've left the Middle East, and Russia and to some extent China and also Iran have been playing a much major role in the Middle East. And Biden is saying no, and they brought warships, as you know, off the coast of Israel and Cyprus. It's a very, very large, it's not just one warship, it's a cluster of ships around. So this is a very pivotal moment. And I think Biden is making clear where he stands, that he stands with Israel, which is why he's coming. You've also had Secretary of State Blinken and the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was in Israel yesterday. So it's a kind of reversion to old-style American diplomacy while they stand with their allies. One thing I'd say as well is it probably hasn't quite been taken on board in some countries just how devastating this attack was for Israel. You know, it was an attack deliberately on civilians, babies, children, rapes, old people, 90-year-olds executed, Holocaust survivors, and so on. 200 hostages, not military hostages, but babies. And again, people in their 80s and 90s, disabled children. Today, the Harry Potter author, J.K. Rowling, sent out a plea to release a 12-year-old disabled girl, Israeli disabled girl who's being held hostage by Hamas because she's a Harry Potter fan. I mean, there is no justification in any conflict anywhere. Even ISIS didn't take babies. So Hamas have made, I think, a strategic mistake in thinking they can drum up support. Now, the conflict could end today if Hamas released all the hostages and handed over those people who committed murder to some kind of international court or tribunal. But clearly they're not going to go do that. So I'm afraid I think we're only at the beginning of the conflict.
Now, what are the potential consequences of President Joe Biden's visit to Israel in the midst of this conflict, and how might it affect U.S. foreign policy in the region? Is it a gamble for him?
Yes, it is a gamble because, you know, he is very publicly siding with Israel. And if the war goes very badly and the death toll is much more significant than it has been to date, it could look bad for Biden. On the other hand, the Americans are sick of Iran. Iran, of course, is the main actor that drives Hamas and funds Hamas and Hezbollah and militias in Yemen and Syria and elsewhere. And this is a message to Iran that the United States is fed up with Iran. They've been putting up with Iranians, you know, attacking American interests in Lebanon and elsewhere. You know, the bad blood goes all the way back to the 1979 hostage crisis, where the new Islamic government in Iran seized a lot of American diplomats and others and held them hostage for, I can't remember, about a year or something. And these warships that they brought are a message to Iran. Hamas, if you like, are a small pawn in the Iranian fiefdom across the Middle East. And I think we also see most of the Arab countries, or at least the governments, they would love to see Hamas destroyed. I mean, Hamas is not popular in the Arab world, apart from among Islamists. And to be honest, it's not popular among Palestinians either. If there was some way of changing government without any loss of life or civilian life in Gaza, I'm sure most Palestinians do not support Hamas. They would rather be governed by Fatah or by a properly democratic Palestinian government, not even by Fatah. So we have to see where this heads. But I think, your report before I came on compared this to the other smaller conflicts we've seen in Gaza since Israel left Gaza in 2005. You said, I think there are 4 other smaller conflicts in like 2009, 2012, 2014. This is of an entirely different magnitude. One cannot compare that. There wasn't a proper ground invasion. It looks like there will be. Just the population movement we already see within Gaza is much bigger than anything else we've seen. One other point, I think, is the diplomacy with Egypt. Of course, Egypt shares a border with Gaza. It will be very easy for Egypt to allow, say, women and children and old people to take temporary refuge in Egypt. They've got plenty of space. And I think that, the international community, the West, Qatar would fund temporarily them staying over the border until the war is finished between Hamas and Israel. And, usually in conflicts, we see civilian populations move out of the firing line. We saw it in, for example, Ukraine, where millions of Ukrainians moved to Poland and other neighboring countries. We saw it in Syria. 4 million Syrians went to Turkey, of course, and 1 million went to Lebanon. And Lebanon is a tiny country. Egypt's a huge country. I don't think only Israel should be asked questions. I think the question is, why is Egypt not allowing temporary refuge so they can get out of harm's way and civilians and not be affected by this fighting?
Now, we've talked about Israeli side, but with the dire humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza, with the blockade in place, what other options are available to the international community to provide immediate relief to the affected population?
Well, they can airlift supplies in. What they're worried about is while Hamas is still in control, I mean, the UN officials only yesterday said that Hamas came at gunpoint and stole a lot of the food and other stuff. So even if humanitarian stuff comes through, it's often stolen by Hamas, I'm afraid. Can you hear me? It seems to have frozen the screen.
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Sorry, okay. So, look, what I just said, the most immediate thing would be to open the border with Egypt so that non-combatants can temporarily seek refuge over the border until the fighting's finished and then return. And there would be safety for them then. Even if all 2 million Palestinians moved temporarily across the border and Qatar or America gave them $1,000 each, that's $2 billion, which is much less than they give in aid to Gaza already. But the problem is Hamas are completely mixed in with the civilian population in Gaza. They're operating from tunnels and schools and hospitals and so on. So it is impossible to fight a war without civilians being caught up in it. So there are only 2 choices. Either you don't fight a war, you leave Hamas in place, which is, only postponing it for the next war, or Hamas resign, which they're not going to do, or they are defeated militarily, which seems to be what's going to happen.
Now, you've mentioned about Egypt. So as the war escalates, what role do neighboring countries and international organizations like the United Nations play in finding a peaceful resolution to the crisis?
Well, I'm sure there's lots of diplomacy going on. Secretary of State Blinken, I think he's been to 5 different countries in the last 10 days. He was originally going to come to the region for 2 days. He's already on his 10th day. He's doing shuttle diplomacy. He was also in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, which of course is an ally of Iran, and Qatar also have the Hamas leadership. I should point out, by the way, the Hamas leadership are living in the luxury Four Seasons hotel in Qatar, while the people of Gaza are suffering. I mean, I don't know if there can be much diplomacy, because it's like negotiating with ISIS or something. ISIS was defeated in Mosul when the Iraqis and Americans and British wanted to take back Mosul, which is, of course, the second biggest city in Iraq, 3.7 million people, the second biggest city after Baghdad. It's twice the population of Gaza, approximately. So the civilian population moved out of Mosul temporarily while America and others took back Mosul and defeated ISIS. There couldn't have been a negotiation between ISIS and others, because ISIS wanted to kill others. They wanted complete supremacy. They didn't want to compromise. And it's clear that Hamas also don't want to compromise. I mean, what is their aim exactly? They have ruled over Gaza since 2006. Israel left in 2005. And they've had a lot of money and chances. There are no Israelis or Jews living in Gaza. The only ones there are people who Hamas kidnapped and brought into Gaza. What exactly do Hamas want? There've been masses of international aid. They could have built a very nice infrastructure and city. In fact, for example, the sewage system isn't good enough in Gaza. Israel and others have provided them with all kinds of modern piping for sewage system. Instead of building a sewage system, they use this pipes to build rockets to fire back to kill Israelis. So what do Hamas want here? They're not. How is anyone meant to compromise with them if they don't want to compromise? So the international community can intervene, but they can get a ceasefire, but it will just postpone it for the next time. It's not it won't resolve anything. In the medium term, it will be better if the Palestinian Authority, run from Ramallah by Mahmoud Abbas, or his successor, because he's already 88, so he may not be a leader for that much long. They, at least in theory, are interested in negotiations, and then the international community can squeeze some kind of compromise out of Israel and out of the Palestinian Authority to create a two-state solution, which is what, all people of goodwill want. They want two states, one for Israelis, one for Palestinians. But Hamas are an obstacle to this. They're not part of a settlement. It's clear. And by the way, their attacks were not aimed at soldiers. They were deliberately aimed at civilians. Israel has horribly killed some civilians, but Israeli attacks are not aimed at civilians. It's like the difference between, somebody accidentally killing someone because they lose control of their car, or someone deliberately revving up their car to drive into a bunch of people to murder them. There is a clear difference, both morally and in international law. And Hamas admit it themselves. They aim at civilians. And I don't know if someone can come up with a better answer for how to compromise with Hamas, I'd love to hear it, because no one has come up with any such answer.
Now, what is the strategy for Israel in Gaza? Is it doing enough to prevent civilian casualties in Gaza?
Well, it's extremely difficult for Israel, but to avoid civilian casualties. I don't think Israel wants to cause civilian casualties, but look, Israel's being asked to move people out of the line of fire, so it asked them to move to the south. It's obviously logistically a very difficult thing for Palestinians to do. They've asked them to move out of the way in order to fight with Hamas. So obviously, if they're not civilians in the areas where they're fighting with Hamas, then there won't be civilian casualties. So Israel's doing what's been asked of it. It's asked civilians to get out of the firing line, which is, by the way, again, what happens in other conflicts. But again, it's Hamas that are physically trying to prevent civilians from moving, because they know that their best defense is to mix themselves in with the civilian population. It makes it much harder to fight them. But, I think what we saw with the atrocities of October 7th and the days that follow, that Israel's had it with Hamas. They repeatedly getting rocket fire. Israel did what the international community asked. It left Gaza in 2005 completely. No Israeli citizen, no soldier. And remember, Jews have lived in Gaza on and off for 3,000 years, twice as long as, say, Islam has since the foundation of Islam. And this is the first time in history where no Jews live in Gaza, apart from the hostages. So Israel left, and Israel's just fed up. It's fed up with getting rocket attacks. What can it do? It doesn't want Hamas there anymore. Unless Hamas will moderate.
Mm-hmm. Now, given the limited access to basic necessities such as water, food, and medical supplies, how can the international community ensure that aid reaches those in need in a safe and efficient manner, considering the security concerns on the ground?
Well, the most obvious way is to come in through Egypt. But the Egyptians are, if anything, they're being more hardline than Israel. They're refusing to open the border points between Egypt and Gaza. And there are trucks and aid convoys waiting on the Egyptian side of the border. And I presume that Secretary of State Blinken is trying to pressure the government in Egypt to allow the aid in. It's not that there isn't aid there. There's masses of aid waiting to go in. I hear talk that once the civilians are in a separate area than the Hamas fighters, Israel itself will probably airlift medical supplies and food and so on for civilians. But it's not easy because, as I mentioned already in this interview, the UN themselves said that Hamas are simply stealing any international aid that comes in for civilians. They're just taking it. They're taking things like cooking oil and they're using it to fire at rockets, to fire at Israel. So it's extremely difficult for international aid agencies to make sure that the humanitarian relief goes to the people that need it and is not diverted to Hamas.
Now, lastly, prior to these events, the Israeli government under Netanyahu was struggling to gain momentum. Now that this war is upon us, do you believe that despite the judicial reforms and internal troubles, the support for Netanyahu will grow?
No, I don't. I think that Netanyahu's career is over. I think he will lead Israel for the duration of this conflict. And I think once the conflict's over, there will be a huge internal inquiry in Israel as to how this very powerful country, Israel, with supposedly very good security, was breached by 2,500 Hamas terrorists or fighters raiding Israel. It took Israel days to get back control of its own territory. People were held for 2 days while they were gang raped and tortured, Israeli civilians. No Israeli prime minister, no prime minister in any democracy could survive after this. Even if it wasn't personally Netanyahu's fault, he will take responsibility. So will the heads of the military intelligence, the army chief of staff, the intelligence agencies. I think all of them will go. So I think Netanyahu's career is over. And of course, he's the longest standing prime minister in Israeli history. But it may not go overnight. There may be a 1-year transitional unity government or something while new elections are held. But I don't think Israelis are going to turn against their government in the midst of war. But he's finished. In fact, if I can make a comparison, there was a big war in 2006 between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon after Hezbollah mounted a cross-border raid and kidnapped some Israelis. And Ehud Olmert, who was then the prime minister of Israel, they fought a war with Hezbollah, lasted a few weeks, and afterwards Olmert lost. He basically, I don't think he stood again, even in the election. His career was over. So of course one can never say never, but I cannot imagine Netanyahu continuing much longer once this conflict is over as prime minister.
Gross, thank you for your analysis.
Thank you.